All right. I'm reminding you, your test is next Wednesday. And I'm going to go over a couple of scenarios today that are going to be short answer questions on your test. But for starters, I want to remind you that, what did I say about biodiversity? Variation, and it could be quantity, because we talked about different types of diversity. It could be species diversity, it could be genetic diversity, it could be ecological diversity, functional diversity. But what did I say will not happen if there's no biodiversity? Evolution. Keep that in mind, because that's all we're going to talk about today. Organisms will struggle to survive because an environmental condition, or any condition, resources, other species, shelter, which is resources, at the end of the day, are limited. The struggle will happen because there's no variation to thrive for that specific condition, okay? If you don't explain that, when you have to explain evolution, you're starting off wrong. So the first thing you always want to say is there's variation. So yesterday we talked about relationships. Today we're going to focus on where we left off yesterday, which was evolution. Now in the presentations, we saw an example of micro, very vaguely, and I was fine with that because I wanted to explain it. There's two main categories of evolution. When you hear the word micro, what do you think? Small. I mean, I was going like this. And macro, big, right? So large scale evolution versus small scale evolution. The diagram to the left, one of them, either vertical or horizontal, is describing micro, and one of them, either vertical or horizontal, is describing macro. Can you look at that diagram and tell me which one do you think is micro and which do you think is macro, and why? And why? I'll pause. Micro is small scale evolution. I'm going to tell you this. Micro is a theory and macro is a hypothesis. Now, one of them, vertical or horizontal, describes micro, and one of them, vertical or horizontal, describes macro. Can you indicate which one and why? Try.
There's less changes, so it's horizontal, whereas vertical would be bigger changes and more changes.
But explain it. What do you mean by less change and bigger change? It's funny that you think that. What is happening vertically? Look at it. Both of them are evolution. Literally, it's going from lizard to bird. That is huge change. Yes? What's happening in the bottom? Same species, changes like what? Color, size. So you're seeing variation within the same species over time, small changes in genetic variation that make up the population like we do right here. But when you see this is macro, you're seeing a large scale evolution. And again, macro is simply a hypothesis which describes, in a sense, what scientists believe is the origin of species. Change over time gave rise to new species. Specific environmental conditions led to that. Obviously, that is something that can never be proven and something we don't believe in, right? All right, we're going to focus on everything evolution today. First, we're going to focus on factors that can impact evolution. Then we're going to focus on what happens to specific species through evolution. And then we're going to talk about types of evolution, starting from the common ones to a little bit more varied ones that you might have not heard of, okay? So what factors can contribute to evolution? Reproduction, for sure. Without it, you can't even have evolution. Definite factor. Well, yes, you definitely, that is a factor. What else? The environment and variation. Yes, genetics. You can't have evolution without these things. You can't even describe a scenario if you don't talk about what environmental condition favors a specific genetic trait and leads to reproduction of that specific species and gives rise to a population or evolution of that population with that trait, okay? So, we'll start with reproductive isolation. How can that impact evolution? Or what is that? It prevents species from reproducing. Clearly the word says it. Factors can be location, obstacles in the environment, mental, I just don't want to, some kind of sense. There's so many things that could lead to that. But if you don't reproduce, evolution can give rise to a specific trait over time. Does that make sense? Just, it happens. It could be that we are physically separated and no, it's never two different species. Okay? Species make up population. Genes make up species, species make up population. Genetic variation leads to adaptation of a species, leads to evolution of a population. Okay? Geographical isolation. What is that? Good, but they are separated and somehow it gives rise to a varied form of this. Now, what type of evolution is that we heard of today? Yes. Was that your group? Good job, girl. Yes. Divergent. Common ancestor gives rise, okay, to variation. That's divergent. And geographical isolation is a great example of how divergent evolution can occur. Now, speciation. And all of these are associated, by the way, because clearly here you see reproductive isolation could be because of geography. Did I spell that right? No. Clearly. And geographical isolation can lead to divergent evolution, right? And speciation is a result of geography in some sense. So if it is allopatric speciation, geography is a factor. And it will lead to evolution of a different population of organisms based on favored traits, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Sympatric is anything other than geography. So I'm going to challenge you to give me an explanation of what could have happened here. Sympatric. Because clearly allopatric is easy, right? An earthquake. Yes. That's a great answer. Imported goods from another place allowed a specific species to thrive, okay? That might be it. And they fed off a specific organism more than another. That's a perfect example. And I didn't even give you that example as an option, okay? Okay, try to avoid mentioning movement, okay? Because it seems like it's geographical, right? But making water is more available in the center of, and that specific species of trees requires more water. That makes sense, okay? So the resource availability in the center favored that specific tree. Okay, good. Environmental conditions too, like pollution, climate, sun, availability. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about biomes. You're going to see specific favored traits in specific parts of the world based on environmental conditions. Sure. And others will break in half, right? Which is crazy. All right, who's the father of evolution? Charles Darwin. I got Mendel earlier today, right? He traveled. This rarely comes up on the AP exam, but I just don't feel like it's okay not to mention him. So I'm going to say this is not even going to be on the test. But let's just remember who he is and how he contributed, because he studied primarily what? He studied what? Finches and turtles. In the Galapagos, he traveled the world and saw this. But in that specific island, he saw the variation of finches which are connected to environmental conditions all over the island. And the same with the tortoises. And then he proposed the theory of, which is what? Natural selection. Good job. And I love that you said strongest. I want you to put in your head right now that the survival of the fittest is not referencing strongest. What does the word fittest reference? Overall better, adaptable traits. It is the trait that is better suited for the survival condition of whatever the environment is putting a strain on. Okay? So, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to cover the steps of evolution, and you must mention these steps. Did you notice how I was moving again? Yeah. In your short answers, linked to a specific scenario. So I'm going to tell you right now, variation, environmental condition, adaptation, and reproduction must be in your answer. So I'm going to repeat it. Variation, because if variation does not exist within a gene pool, which make up a population, then you cannot have evolution, or you can't have steps of natural selection. You must have variation. You must reference some kind of environmental condition. And in this case, it's competition for what? A resource. Like in this diagram, what's the resource? Food, right? Which is the leaves of the trees. Okay? You must mention the trait. In this case, what is it? Long necks. The favored trait, or the beneficial trait, or the trait that is most likely to adapt and survive. It's not that the giraffes' necks grow taller. It's that there were tall giraffes to begin with, and they are favored by this particular environment, so they are the ones that are going to survive. And giraffes that have tall necks that survive will, over time, reproduce offspring with tall necks. Who can give me an example of variation in this class? Different hair colors, okay? How can that impact our environment? Give me one that you can put into a scenario that could lead to evolution. Blondes get treated better, and why not? It is totally fake, and that's okay, just like your scenarios were. And over time, the non-blondes felt defeated, so the blondes reproduced more offspring. I accept. Very strange, but okay. What else? I love this one. So you're in variation exists within this population, and there's variety of sight ability. Forget about eye color, right? Because we can't genetically say light eyes struggle to see. It's variation of being able to see. And those that sit closer to the front have a better chance, let's say for an A. It's the same thing, okay? You have to start with variation. I'm going to repeat this. Then you have to explain some environmental condition, explain the favored trait, and end with the fact that that favored trait reproduces offspring with that specific trait. Population evolves, okay? So now we're going to talk about the shifts, okay, which we heard about them in your examples. So it can make more sense. Yep. This? Okay. Survival of the fittest. Remember, that doesn't mean strongest. In this case, what was fittest? The tall necks. So size of necks is the fittest. Fittest can be smartest. Fittest can be weakest. Fittest can be strongest. I'm not saying it can't be, but don't think of survival of the fittest as the strong survives. Yes, question? These graphs explain the 3 shifts that can happen during natural selection, or really any form of evolution, because when you look at evolution, it doesn't matter what you describe, it's a form of natural selection, okay? Variation always exists within the population. So your original graph is always going to be a bell-shaped curve. In this case, it's a dotted line. And the only way I could tell is because I'm seeing the different curves. Now, directional can also look like this, shift in one direction. It could also look like this, shift in another direction. It's shift in the direction of the extreme trait within the variation of the population. Stabilizing is the average trait, survives, and disruptive is both traits. I'm going to show you a picture of the last group's presentation, which was fantastic, of disruptive selection, okay? Now, I could give you a scenario like this on the test. For starters, I'm going to ask, how are we interpreting these graphs? Right to left or up, down? How do you know it's up, down? That's true, but let's say I didn't put any errors. How do we know it's up, down? There's one answer. How do I? What's the first thing you have to mention?
It's vertical, big change.
What's the first thing you have to mention? Variation. You see variation in each of the tops? Going to less variation. It's showing something being favored. There's pressures in the environment and specific traits are being favored. Okay? Now, who can describe this scenario right here? For 4 points on the test. We already talked about the first one. Use this diagram to describe natural selection. You got to start. You weren't here. This is worth 4 points, and I'm giving you the answer on the test. How to answer this question properly in the video. Yes. Point number 1. There is a variety of different color beetles in the environment. Point number 2. They're competing to try to stay safe from different predators. I accept. So use the colors as your example. Over time, the beetle with the, fill it in, help them out. The average colored beetle is favored. If it's light, it would be directional. If it's dark, it would be directional. If it's light and dark, it would be disruptive. But when it's average, it's stabilizing. So the average colored beetle blends more with the environment. Let me just be clear. You didn't even have to mention competition. You could say there's a variation color of beetles. The average colored beetle blends better with the environment. So the light and dark colored are targeted by the predators, and over time the average trait reproduces offspring with the average colored beetle. Does that make sense? Now, I will tell you, the example on the test will not be color. That's why I chose color to describe the example, but the example you're going to get will be something completely other than color. It could be height, strength, intelligence, texture. Could be anything that you create a scenario to describe. The second part of this question would say, what type of natural selection? Because you might have a choice to describe the type you want. So you can make the scenario into anything you want, but then you have to nail what type of natural selection that is. Okay?